Hi, my name is Kate Scarlata. I'm a registered dietitian and owner of the practice for a Digestive Peace of Mind, which is a nutrition consultation practice outside of Boston in Medway, Massachusetts.
Hello everyone, I'm Toni Fiori. I'm also a registered dietitian that works here with Kate.
So today we thought we would talk about who might benefit from the low FodMAP diet. The low FodMAP diet is not a diet designed for everyone in America. It's really should be used specifically for certain people to help manage GI distress. So why don't we start with what the heck is the low FodMAP diet?
Yes, so let's start with that. So FodMAPs are a group of small carbohydrates that are commonly malabsorbed or not completely broken down in the small intestine, which means they remain intact and they become a food source for the bacteria that naturally live in our gut. And when this bacteria feeds off of the intact carbohydrates, otherwise known as FodMAPs, they can produce gas as a byproduct, which can lead to belching, bloating, flatulence, all that fun stuff.
Yeah,
right?
It's so fun, right? So fun.
And the other thing that FodMAPs can do, particularly polyols and excess fructose, is they can pull water into the intestine. So for someone with diarrhea, that can definitely exacerbate things.
Absolutely. And the low FodMAP diet is not a long-term strategy per se. It's really a three-part diet. So the initial phase is called the Elimination Phase, where high FodMAP foods are restricted from the diet. And then it is followed up by the reintroduction or challenge phase, where different FodMAP subtypes, such as lactose, would be gently added back into the diet and sort of titrate up to see how patients tolerate that particular FodMAP. And if they tolerate it fine, then it gets added back in the third phase of the diet, which is sort of the integration diet, where you add back FodMAPs that are not a problem, that don't cause symptoms. So, as I mentioned earlier, the low FodMAP diet is really not designed for healthy individuals that don't experience GI symptoms. So let's talk through just a few types of people that might benefit, or conditions that might benefit from the low FodMAP diet.
So I'm starting with the most straightforward one, I'd say, IBS, or Irritable Bowel Syndrome. And 1 in every 5 Americans, is that the stat now?
It is, up to 1 in 5, which is crazy.
Yes, that's
a lot of people.
Yes, suffer from these symptoms that we were just talking about: bloating, gas, belching, pain, altered bowel habits. So for people with IBS, the low FodMAP diet can definitely help.
Absolutely. And another population or condition, I should say, that might benefit from the low FodMAP diet are individuals that have celiac disease, have gone on a gluten-free diet, and still have continuation of their GI symptoms. We've found in clinical practice that a subset of those patients also have IBS-like symptoms, and they benefit as well from a reduction of FodMAPs in the diet. So it definitely should be considered for that population where the gluten-free diet doesn't seem to be quite enough. What about...
I'm thinking the other I'm like, what's my next one? Inflammatory bowel disease. Sorry.
Yes.
So inflammatory bowel disease is otherwise known as IBD, and it consists primarily of ulcerative colitis, which impacts the large intestine, and Crohn's disease, which can affect both the small and the large intestine. So for talking about Crohn's disease, often those people may malabsorb excess fructose because the absorption is in the small intestine.
Right.
So they could benefit from the low FodMAP diet, but also ulcerative colitis. And how I explain it is, most of our bacteria, or a good majority of our bacteria, naturally is found in our large intestine. So if the FODMAPs are intact and being fed upon in the large intestine by the bacteria, that can certainly exacerbate symptoms or irritate things for those with inflammation in the large intestine.
Exactly. And one of the byproducts of FODMAP digestion or what the microbes do is they produce acid. And having a certain amount of acid in the colon can be beneficial. It prevents pathogenic bacteria from overgrowing. But there is sort of that concept is too much not a good thing for some people. So that research needs to be kind of further elucidated in the science. But I think it is another area where we could see the low FODMAP diet making a difference in some patients with IBD as well.
One more thing that's just popping into my head. There is an overlap in IBS-like symptoms when there is no inflammation going on currently for inflammatory bowel disease patients.
Right.
So I think for those people, they're constantly thinking it's a flare.
Right.
Where if you have that conversation with your doctor, you might find you're experiencing some just irritable bowel syndrome.
Exactly. So your IBD might not be the cause of these symptoms, but rather you also have the IBS overlap.
That's the gray area I just like to clarify.
Yeah, definitely. So another group of people that might benefit are endurance athletes that experience GI distress. In part, maybe those endurance athletes actually fit the criteria for IBS, or just the act of exercise can contribute to digestive issues. In part, when you're exercising your muscles, all the blood flow goes to your working muscles and heart and lungs and away from your intestine. And that's associated with greater permeability in your intestine and exacerbation of symptoms, especially in runners. It's been estimated that 30 to 83% of runners experience some level of GI distress, so it's quite common. And 7% of triathletes actually abandon their race due to GI distress. So is this an area that maybe a short-term or modified FODMAP diet may benefit endurance athletes? And the research is still bearing out. It's definitely new. But what they have found is that most athletes actually restrict at least one FODMAP. And for those that do, they find that their symptoms are improved. They have looked at the typical one in a case study. They looked at one athlete who is an endurance athlete, and his consumption was up to 83 grams of FODMAPs a day. Now remember, FODMAPs are carbohydrates, and athletes tend to eat a lot of carbs. A typical sort of Australian diet, and that's because most of the research is done in Australia that we know, but a typical Australian diet is about 24 grams of FODMAPs a day, and a low FODMAP diet would be somewhere, in the 7 to 8 grams of FODMAPs a day. So think of 81 grams of FODMAPs, that's a lot of FODMAPs. So it could be that just a little tweaking of the diet can really help minimize some of the symptoms that runners in particular or athletes that do intense endurance activities experience. So again, it would be more of a short-term approach unless, of course, the athlete had IBS, then it would be maybe a modified FODMAP diet for a bit. So that is another population that I wanted to talk about. And as myself, I am a runner and have run a marathon, and I ran a marathon after I had major intestinal surgery. And one of the things that I really found was, a lot of the carb replenishers, the goos and things like that just didn't really work for me. And there are other alternatives out there that are lower in FODMAPs that can work too. So endurance athletes are something, they should consider the low FODMAP diet or talking to their healthcare provider about that.
And I just want to add, I think it is important, especially for all populations, but I find that some athletes don't want the runner's trots, and then they're Googling the low FODMAP diet, and then they just remove all the foods that were a main source of energy for them.
Right.
So find a dietitian, find a specialist,
right.
Make sure you're eating enough, because FODMAPs are just a piece of your overall health.
Absolutely, and you probably don't have to modify them down to a full-blown elimination diet. I think athletes can just tweak and cherry pick out certain FODMAPs. So absolutely. In fact, for anyone thinking about changing their diet, we always recommend talk to your health professional before you adjust your diet, and work with a dietitian when you're ready to go, so you can balance your diet. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about SIBO. This is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth.
Yeah, well, I was just chiming in. I'm thinking that we were just talking about the bacteria. The FODMAPs are a major food source for bacteria. So if they naturally live in large numbers in your large intestine, and now they're creeping up into the small intestine where you're doing the digestion, right? Most of the digestion.
Exactly.
They're having a field day in there. So why don't you elaborate on that? That's how I like to picture it.
Exactly. So small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is a normal condition where a lot of bacteria that most often that resided in your colon have creeped up into the small intestine and contribute to symptoms that really mimic IBS. And because of that, the symptoms are such a similar profile, we find that for most patients with SIBO, is the acronym for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, they fare very well with the low FODMAP diet approach. And of course, we tailor it to their personal tolerance. It doesn't need to be the strict elimination diet forever. We really want to maximize their intake and liberalize their diet to their tolerance. But although there's no evidence to support the use in the low FODMAP diet for SIBO, there's really no diet with evidence. And we feel this makes the most theoretical and logical sense. And in clinical practice, it works really well for our patients with SIBO. So that's a wrap, I think. I think those are, some major conditions that may warrant a trial of the low FODMAP diet, but as always, consult your doctor and work with a dietitian to make the experience go smoother and funner and healthier. Thank you for listening.